everybody, it's Jay Roby. I wanted to make this quick endgame video tonight based on a Blitz game that I played recently. And I wanted to make this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm behind in material. I'm playing white in this position. My opponent was playing black. And for all intents and purposes, if played properly, it's a win for black. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, resigning and when to resign and when I think it's a good time to resign. And in this position, I didn't want to resign, even though I knew that I was behind in material and my opponent with solid play would probably just, end up crushing me. But my motto is that I like to see what happens in the end game as much as I possibly can, whether I'm winning, losing, or if I feel like I'm in an equal position. Because what happens if you always resign when you think that you're behind too much material or positional strength is that you end up only getting to play the end games where you either have an advantage or you think that the position is equal. So you're totally cutting out a whole bunch of games from your end game practice, especially as a newer chess player. It's totally reasonable at the top levels of chess or even in the higher ratings that aren't, international masters to resign when you're pretty confident that your opponent is not going to make a mistake in the position. But when you first start getting going in chess, you're going to have a lot of losses. And I was no different and still am. When it comes to Blitz, I have my fair share of losses. But cutting all of those out of endgame practice, in my opinion, just isn't worth the sacrifice in terms of, getting better at the end game. And I'm looking forward to your guys' thoughts on that. But I'm really a firm believer in fighting it out to the end and having the opponent earn the win. Now, like I said before, though, if you're totally behind like a crushing amount of material, or your position is just dead, like in my last Blitz video, I had the last game in it. And, my position was just dead. There was nothing that I could do, and my opponent had very straightforward moves to win the game. But in a position like this, I'm behind material. I wanted to fight it out. So my opponent offered up the queen trade in this position. I went ahead and took, and once my opponent recaptured, I played my king up now to g3. And the next series of moves were pretty logical from both sides. My opponent played h5 to defend that pawn, and I played my pawn up now to c4. And what my plan was is that I wanted to push my c-pawn up, and then after a trade of pawns takes place, I could push up my pawns into a very nice wedge with the pawn supporting the pawn island here on a3. So basically I would have pawns on these three squares. This pawn would be gone on b6, and then basically what I would do is I would make it very difficult for my opponent to handle my pawns in that position, because what's going to happen is, due to the pawn being all alone here on a7, my opponent is going to constantly have to worry about the pawn on c5 marching towards promotion. So the king is going to be very much married to this pawn to prevent that from happening. So from here now, play continued. My opponent played the king up now to f7, and I pushed my pawn up to c5, going ahead with my plan. My opponent captured, and I recaptured myself. And from here now, my opponent played king to e6, and I pushed my pawn up, going ahead with my plan to create that nice wedge, that nice pawn island with the strong base. And my opponent played king to d5. So there's really no variations here that I could see in the computer so far from the moves that were played. So from here, I pushed my pawn up to a3, and then my opponent replied pawn now to g5, which is a good move because it's blocking access for my king on both f4 and h4. And from here now, I brought my king down to g2 because basically I have to keep my king in this area. These pawns are going to be coming down, and I'm going to have to use my king along with my pawn on f2 to try to salvage the situation. So from here, my opponent pushes the pawn down to h4, and I play my king over to f1. And once again, I'm not too worried about this pawn island over here, because if my opponent's king gets too far away from this pawn, I can just march that towards promotion. So I really like the setup that I had here. But that being said, there are still some really big threats here that my opponent has. From here, my opponent plays h3, and I play king over to g1, and now my opponent plays king to c6. Now I'm going to back up one step here. My opponent missed a crushing move in this position. If you want to pause the video and see if you can find it, definitely go ahead and do so. But the move that would have won the game outright was simply to play g3 in this position, because I really have no good options here. I have to take the pawn, and once I do that, my opponent can push the e pawn down now to e3. And basically what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at two pieces that are bearing down on me that are coming to promote. Both are passed, and I only have one piece to deal with both of them, which is a lost and hopeless cause. For example, after I play g4, which is the only move that I really have, my opponent simply brings a pawn down now to e2, and I'm done. Because if I play my king over to attack that pawn, my opponent just pushes the pawn to h2, and one of these pawns are going to promote. Now I'm going to flip back a couple moves here. That one of the the reason that I said that the only move I have is to push my pawn is because if I was to move anywhere else with the king, like for example here to h2, this pawn just comes down to e2 and it's going to promote. There's nothing that I'm going to be able to do to stop it. So basically the only move I had was g4, and at which point my opponent can simply play now pawn to e2, and it's all over from this point. So my opponent had the win. g3 definitely would have ended the game off, but my opponent, instead of playing that, played the king now to c6. Now, there's really not a lot that this move is accomplishing because there's not really a lot that the king can do in this position, even though the pawn is here on a7 to begin attacking this pawn formation. So the victory for my opponent definitely was not in this area of the board. In fact, it was on this area of the board that my opponent missed the win. So from here, play continued now king to h2. I have to keep my king in this position. These pawns are a massive threat. And my opponent played king to b5. Now, I didn't mind that move whatsoever, because if my opponent plays his king to a4 or even c4 in this position, I can just march my c pawn up to promote, because the king is always going to be one step behind. This pawn is passed. There's no other pawns on the adjacent b file or d file, so there's nothing my opponent can do to stop that pawn from promoting. So my opponent is kind of locked here in this position currently. So from here, I play king to g3, and my opponent brings the king back now to c6, and I just repeat my moves. I go back to h2, and now my opponent pushes the pawn up to a5. Now from this position here, I didn't want to capture, because if I would have captured, for example, taking the pawn here on a5, the enemy king's just going to munch up all my pawns, and that would liberate the enemy king to come marching down into this side of the board. Because once again, this king is kind of married to protecting the c5 pawn from promotion. And how that would look is basically, if I took the pawn, the king can just come in and grab this pawn here like that, and I really don't have any good options. If I try to get smart and try to, prevent the king from accessing b5, the king can just push up, and really there's not much that I can do. Play could follow pawn to a6, and then the king just comes in and eats up all the pawns. Alternatively, if I try to push the pawn, like say for example, after it captures, the king will take here on c5. If I try to just immediately push the pawn to a6, same thing. The king's going to come in, going to get all the pawns, and the most important thing here is that the king is going to be able to come and support the pawns on this side of the board, and there's nothing that I'm going to be able to do to stop the king from helping one of these pawns promote. So capturing definitely wasn't in my best option. So instead what I played is king to g3, and my opponent moved his king now to b5, trying to bring his king even closer to support his pawn. But once again, the c5 pawn is just monstrous in this position. So I just moved my king back to h2. My opponent captured and I recaptured. And in this position, if my opponent were to take my pawn here, I can just march mine up to promotion and get the queen and have the game outright. And my opponent realized that. So after capturing the pawn on b4, my opponent then moved his king now to c6. So these two pawns here are just a menacing threat to this king. So the king definitely cannot leave the area, just as I can't leave this area. So from here, play continues now. I move my king to g3, and my opponent brings his king now to d5, kind of trying to give me the impression that he's going to be able to bring his king down. But once again, if he comes any farther down towards my side of the board, I can just march up to promote. So from here, I've just moved my king back to h2 again, and my opponent pushed the pawn up now to e3. Now, this was a crucial moment in the game, because what my opponent had done is he did some calculating, and basically what my opponent did was calculated bringing his king down to f3, allowing one of these pawns here on the g file or the h file to promote, and allowing me also to promote at the same time. And it turned out to be a big mistake for my opponent because it allowed me to get a queen and I would not be in check. And we'll see how that happened. So from once my opponent pushed the pawn down, I knew I could just go ahead and capture. My opponent brought the king down to e4 and I marched up towards promotion by pushing to c6. Now all of a sudden my opponent has no other option but to go ahead with his plan because this pawn on the c file is going to promote very quickly and my opponent doesn't even have time to come down and take the pawn on e3. Instead, he's going to have to try to go ahead with his plan of bringing the king down and getting his promotion taken care of. So from here now, my opponent plays king to f3, I push up to c7, and now my opponent has to take care of his promotion. So he pushes g3 with check, I take the pawn now on h3, and he pushes his pawn now to g2. So we're both one step away from promotion, but the key thing here is that once my opponent promotes, I'm not going to be in check. So I'm going to have a queen on the board that I'm going to be able to utilize. So from here, I could just go ahead and promote my queen. He plays his promotion as well and gets the queen on g1. And from here now, I land the check on b7. Now, unfortunately for me, this was a mistake in my own calculations because it turns out queen to b7 creates a drawn position. But nonetheless, my opponent made some mistakes that let me win the game because once he peeled his king off to f2, I hit the check again on f7, and when he moved his king to e1, I moved my queen up to c7, and the sole point of doing that is I wanted to be able to block the check if he took the pawn. My opponent did end up taking that pawn. I blocked the check, and here my opponent just gave me the queen trade. And in this position, he resigned because there's nothing that is going to be able to stop this pawn from promoting on the b file. As it turns out, though, however, instead of queen to b7, I could have played the much stronger queen to f5 check. And it doesn't really matter what my opponent does here. If he takes the pawn or goes to e2, I'm going to be able to generate a winning position. So for example, if he takes the pawn on e3, I can just land the check now on c5, and look at that, there goes the queen. Alternatively, if he would have moved the king down to e2, I can just hit the check here on g4, and then once the queen trade is taken place, I can march up my b pawn to promotion as well. So I definitely thought that it was an interesting endgame to take a look at for a couple reasons. Like I said at the beginning of the video here, I definitely don't like to give up and resign too early, even if I'm behind a little bit of material, because I think it's really important to have that practice at the end game in all of your games. You know, unless you're in a completely dead position or you're just behind so much material that it's not even worth it. Because it's not just about moving your pieces when you're in these end game positions. It's also about generating the candidate lines that your opponent has at their disposal and what their options are. And that's a lot of endgame practice that is thrown out the window if you resign a lot in positions where you're a little bit behind in material, or you feel that your positional strength is definitely not in your favor. So definitely make your opponents earn the win, and definitely looking forward to your guys' feedback and comments on the video and the position. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.